Solve this, and I'll give you $100 million, the billionaire sneered, tossing the folded sheet of paper toward her like it was refused. His voice dripped with condescension as he added, "But don't embarrass yourself. You're just the maid's daughter." The lounge erupted in uneasy laughter, a ripple of sound bouncing off the marble floors and golden chandeliers. Some guests chuckled nervously, glancing around to gauge if it was safe to join in. Others smirked outright, their phones already raised, ready to record what they expected would be a moment of pitiful humiliation. The Arab billionaire reclined back in his velvet chair, flanked by investors and sycophants who fawned at his every word. He was known for this sort of spectacle, flaunting not just his wealth but his so-called superior intellect, using arrogance as a weapon to put others in their place. In his world, knowledge was a toy, a prop to display alongside his watches and cars. And tonight, his target was a young girl who had dared to cross the invisible line between the help and the elite. She stood in the center of the room, calm despite the laughter crackling around her. Her dress was plain, her shoes scuffed, her hands trembling only slightly, but her eyes, steady, focused, unwilling to drop, carried a quiet fire. She didn't flinch when the paper landed at her feet. She didn't rush to defend herself. She simply bent down, picked it up, and unfolded it with deliberate care. "Go on," the billionaire jeered. "Show them what you're made of, or rather, what you're not." He chuckled, sipping from a crystal glass, certain he'd already won. The crowd leaned in, curiosity piqued. The sheet held a complex riddle, a mathematical puzzle layered with traps, the kind designed to impress academics and humiliate amateurs. It was no party trick. He knew the difficulty. He wanted to prove that brilliance was reserved for those born into power, not for the daughter of a maid. She read in silence. The whispers grew louder. Does she even know what she's looking at? This is cruel, but kind of entertaining. Record it. This is going viral. Still, she didn't speak. She let the billionaire's smirk deepen, letting the laughter ripple again. But her silence wasn't weakness. It was patience. For a moment, her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. Dignity doesn't shout, it waits, and then it roars. The billionaire leaned forward, his grin sharp. "Well, show us how smart the maid's daughter really is." They thought it was impossible for her, but within moments his sneer would turn into silence, and his empire into shame. She had grown up in the shadows of chandeliers she could never touch. While her mother scrubbed hotel floors and polished marble staircases for guests who never learned her name, the girl spent her evenings tucked in corners with second-hand books, the quiet rustle of pages her lullaby. Her life was stitched together by struggle, school by day, survival by night. When others her age slept soundly, she studied under dim lamps in shelter rooms or by the faint glow of streetlights, scribbling equations on scraps of discarded paper. Her mother, exhausted, but resolute, never stopped pushing her to dream beyond the walls that confined them. "Don't let this be the end of your story," she whispered after 12-hour shifts left her hands raw. Her mother's pride was a shield, but it was her grandmother's words that built the armor she carried inside. Dignity doesn't shout, it waits, and then it roars. That mantra followed her everywhere. It taught her that silence wasn't surrender, and patience wasn't weakness. It was strength biding its time. Knowledge became her rebellion. Where others saw poverty, she saw puzzles waiting to be solved. Libraries were her sanctuary, aisles of books where she could lose herself in formulas and theories that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of her world. She didn't just memorize, she devoured. Calculus, physics, advanced mathematics, concepts far beyond her school's curriculum became her companions. She would practice problems on napkins stolen from cafeteria trays, sketch diagrams on cardboard pulled from dumpsters, and review entire textbooks in the hours before dawn. What others dismissed as a maid's daughter, she knew in her heart as something greater, the mind of a scientist, a mathematician, an innovator. She dreamed of one day standing in a lab, or perhaps a lecture hall, proving to the world that brilliance was not confined to bloodlines or bank accounts. The hunger in her stomach was sharp, but the hunger in her mind was fiercer still. On the Other side of the world, and on the opposite end of life's spectrum, lived the man who would one day become her adversary. The billionaire had been born into opulence, his cradle lined with gold, his childhood steeped in extravagance. For him, intellect was not earned but inherited, or so he believed. Surrounded by yes-men, he grew addicted to displays of power. He thrived on control, loved to set traps that proved his superiority, and used money as a weapon to remind others of their place. To him, puzzles and riddles weren't about discovery. They were games, tools to mock those who struggled, to prove that only the elite could claim mastery. His empire wasn't built on humility or wisdom, but on arrogance, dressed in silk suits and fueled by oil-rich coffers. He measured worth not in integrity, but in applause. And every sneer, every condescending laugh, every public humiliation of those beneath him added another brick to his throne of pride. It was inevitable their paths would cross, the girl who believed knowledge was freedom, and the man who believed knowledge was a luxury owned by the powerful. What he didn't know, as he tossed the problem toward her like scraps to a beggar, was that his challenge wasn't exposing her weakness. It was summoning her brilliance. And brilliance, once summoned, doesn't ask for permission to shine. It roars. The room seemed to shrink as all eyes landed on her, the folded sheet of paper trembling faintly in her hand. The billionaire leaned, back in his chair, swirling the amber in his crystal glass as though this were nothing more than another evening's entertainment. His lips curled into that familiar sneer. "Well?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "Or is this too difficult for the maid's daughter? You're wasting our time. These men are here to talk about investments, not to watch a charity case scribble nonsense." Laughter rippled through the lounge, sharp and brittle. Some guests chuckled freely, emboldened by his cruelty. Others covered their mouths with their hands, trying to smother the discomfort growing in their chests. A few phones already raised zoomed in on her face, eager to capture the moment her composure cracked. She did not flinch. She looked down at the paper again, scanning each line with deliberate calm. The numbers and words blurred for only a heartbeat before her focus returned sharper than before. Her fingers trembled slightly as she steadied the sheet, but her breathing was even, controlled. The billionaire wasn't finished. He thrived on dominance, and the silence was an invitation for him to twist the knife. "Tell me, girl," he sneered. "Did your mother teach you algebra between scrubbing my floors? Did you solve equations while polishing silverware? Knowledge is for those born to it, not for those who clean it up after." A roar of laughter followed. More cruel this time. Investors slapped the table. One man guffawed so loudly he drew stares from another corner. A woman in pearls shook her head and muttered, "This is humiliating. She should just leave." But she didn't. She pressed her lips together, eyes fixed on the problem, letting the noise fall away. To the untrained eye, her silence seemed like surrender. To those watching more closely, it looked like something else entirely, a storm gathering in stillness. One of the guests, an older man with kind eyes, leaned toward his companion and whispered, "Look at her. She's not panicking." His friend raised a brow. "She's probably too scared to understand." But the older man shook his head. "No, she's studying it. Look at the way her eyes move. She knows what she's doing." The billionaire tapped the table with impatience. "Any day now," he said, his tone dripping with mock sympathy. "Of course, I'd understand if you wanted to run back to your mother's mop. Leave the thinking to men who can afford it." A few guests laughed nervously. Others winced. The cruelty had begun to sour, teetering dangerously between entertainment and indecency. And yet the billionaire was too intoxicated by the sound of his own voice to notice. She adjusted the paper in her hands, her silence unbroken, calm, steady, focused. The whispers began to split the crowd. "She's frozen. Poor girl. No, watch her. She's writing something in her head. I swear she's solving it. Don't be ridiculous. She's the maid's daughter. This is theater, nothing more." Still she remained, unmoved. The minutes stretched, the tension thickening with every breath. At the back of the room, one of the waiters, a young man not much older than she was, leaned toward a colleague and muttered under his breath, "Careful. sometimes the quiet ones, surprise you. It was said softly, almost drowned in the hum of voices and clinking glasses. But if anyone had been listening closely, they would have realized that this night was not building toward her humiliation. It was building toward him, and though the billionaire smirked and the crowd murmured, none of them were prepared for what would happen when silence finally gave way to brilliance. The billionaire's smirk grew thinner with every second of her silence. His guests shifted, some amused, others impatient, until finally he slammed his palm against the polished table. The sound cracked through the air like thunder. "Enough of this charade," he barked, his voice echoing off marble columns. "Answer, now, or admit you're a fraud. Admit that you're nothing but the maid's daughter pretending to belong among men of intellect." Gasps fluttered through the audience. Some guests chuckled nervously, others leaned forward with anticipation, their phones raised higher. The humiliation, they thought, had reached its peak, but she didn't flinch. She inhaled deeply, squared her shoulders, and lifted her gaze from the paper to the man who had mocked her. "Very well," she said softly, but her voice carried through the room with startling clarity. "I'll answer." The billionaire leaned back, smug, already savoring the defeat he imagined was coming. But as she began to speak, something in the air shifted. She started carefully, outlining the first steps of the problem. Her explanation was methodical, her tone steady, as though she were teaching rather than defending herself. Each number she spoke, each principle she referenced revealed not hesitation but mastery. She broke the complex riddle into parts so simple that even those with no background in mathematics found themselves nodding in understanding. At first, the room was quiet out of curiosity. Then it was quiet out of awe. Her hands moved as she explained, sketching invisible diagrams in the air, mapping equations as if she saw the solution dancing before her eyes. The investors leaned closer. Some of the younger guests instinctively began recording not just her but the equations she scribbled onto the napkin someone handed her. She reached the midpoint of the problem, pausing only to confirm aloud. "This is where most people falter. They think the pattern stops here, but it doesn't." She pressed forward, her logic seamless, her reasoning flawless. The billionaire's smugness began to falter. His brows furrowed, his lips twitched. He leaned forward now, eyes narrowing, beads of sweat beginning to form on his temple as the realization crept in. She was not fumbling in the dark. She was illuminating it. The final step came with a quiet, confident flourish. She set the napkin down on the table, the answer circled neatly, and lifted her eyes to meet his. "That is the solution." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, gasps, audible, raw. A woman in the front row clutched her pearls. A man dropped his phone, the recording still running as it clattered across the floor. Murmurs rippled through the lounge, swelling into an unstoppable tide. "She's right. That's correct. I recognize that formula." She solved it perfectly. The billionaire's face drained of color. He leaned forward, scanning the napkin, his lips moving silently as he tried to follow her reasoning. But it was too late. He knew. Everyone knew. Still, the tests weren't over. From the side of the room, one of the investors, a man with sharp eyes and a skeptical sneer, called out, "That could be luck. Solve this instead." He rattled off a new equation, this one far outside the first problem. Something meant to corner her. She didn't falter. Within moments, she had outlined the approach, her explanation as crisp as before. The skeptic leaned back, his jaw slackening. Another guest tried next. "Then tell me this riddle, if you're so clever." He recited a puzzle. She smiled faintly, gave the correct answer, and added a brief explanation of the logic behind it. The crowd laughed, not at her, but in delight at watching her dismantle challenge after challenge. Soon there was a flood. Equations, puzzles, questions on science, history, even philosophy. Each time she answered with clarity and calm. Some answers came instantly, others after a thoughtful pause. But every answer came. Every test was proof. The room transformed. Where once there had been smirks and laughter, now there was applause. And cheers. Guests who had been recording to mock were now filming to remember, their voices heard on camera gasping in admiration instead of ridicule. Some even stood, clapping mid-demonstration. The billionaire sat frozen, his glass untouched, his pride crumbling. He had orchestrated a scene meant to humiliate her, but instead he had curated his own undoing. Finally, as the applause reached its peak, she turned to him. Her expression was calm, almost gentle, but her words cut sharper than any insult. "Respect," she said, her voice steady, "is worth more than 100 million. The crowd roared. People rose from their seats. The words spread across the room like fire, repeated and echoed. Respect is worth more than 100 million. The billionaire tried to stammer a response. I only meant, this was, but his excuses were drowned in thunderous applause. His guests, once his loyal audience, now clapped for her. Even the staff joined in, their faces lit with pride. Dozens of phones captured every moment. His sneer, her solution, his silence, her words. Clips were already racing toward the internet, destined to be replayed millions of times. The man who had once sat as judge and executioner now sat as the condemned, humiliated not by her cruelty, but by her brilliance. The girl, the maid's daughter, stood taller than anyone else in the room. She had not raised her voice. She had not been insulted. She had simply let her mind speak, and in doing so, shattered the empire of arrogance that had tried to crush her. And as she folded the paper neatly, placing it back on the table, the crowd's thunderous applause made one truth undeniable. The billionaire's words, once a mockery, were now the symbol of his downfall. He had promised 100 million for a solution. Instead, he paid with his pride. The applause thundered through the room, rising higher than the chandeliers, drowning out the billionaire's stammering attempts to reclaim control. For years, he had enjoyed being the center of every gathering, his arrogance treated like charm, his cruelty indulged because of his fortune. But tonight, the tide had turned. His empire of intimidation collapsed in front of his own eyes, and no one was rushing to save him. Guests who had once leaned in to laugh at his mockery now leaned back in their seats, exchanging smirks, not at her, but at him. Some shook their heads in disbelief. One man whispered to his neighbor, loud enough for the cameras to catch, "Imagine it. All that money, all that pride, and he gets outsmarted by the maid's daughter." The neighbor chuckled, replying, "Best investment I've ever seen. Watching him lose." The billionaire's circle of investors, sensing weakness, began to distance themselves immediately. The applause for her became a chorus of whispers against him. He made himself look like a fool. He thought money was power, but she showed him what real power looks like. Arrogant men always fall hardest. The humiliation was public, irreversible, and swift. While he shrank into his chair, red-faced and trembling with rage he dared not show, all eyes turned toward her. The girl who had walked in unnoticed now stood as the undeniable center of the room. She held herself with quiet dignity, not basking in their applause but letting it wash over her like vindication. Then a man rose from the audience. He was older, with silver hair and a reputation that preceded him. Murmurs spread quickly as guests recognized him, a world-renowned academic, philanthropist, and patron of education. He stepped forward, his applause louder and steadier than anyone else's, silencing the room as he approached her. "Young lady," he said, his voice carrying warmth and gravity, "I have spent decades searching for brilliance where the world least expects it. Tonight, I believe I have found it in you." He pulled a card from his pocket, offering it with reverence rather than condescension. "If you are willing, my foundation will sponsor your studies. University, mentorship, whatever you dream of, the opportunity is yours." A hush fell across the lounge. This was no token offer. This was a door opening into a future many in the crowd had spent fortunes chasing for their own children. The girl's hands shook as she accepted the card. Her lips trembled, and for the first time that night, tears glistened in her eyes. She bowed her head and whispered, "Thank you." The crowd erupted again, but this time, their applause wasn't just for her brilliance. It was for her resilience, for the dignity she had carried in silence, the storm she had unleashed when tested, and the grace she showed even in victory. Later that night, away from the lights and the clamor, she found a quiet corner with a borrowed phone. She dialed the number she knew by heart. Her mother answered on the second ring, exhaustion in her voice. "Hello? Mom," the girl said, her voice breaking as tears finally spilled. "It happened. He mocked me in front of everyone. But I solved it. I solved it, Mom. And someone offered me a scholarship, a real chance." On the other end, silence. Then, her mother's voice trembling with pride. "You didn't just solve a problem, baby. You made the world listen." The girl clutched the phone to her chest, sobbing quietly. For all the recognition, all the applause, nothing would ever mean more than those words. Meanwhile, outside the quiet of that moment, the story spread like wildfire. Guests had uploaded clips before the night was even over. Within hours, videos flooded social media, tagged and shared across platforms. One video showed the billionaire sneering, "Solve this and I'll give you $100 million, sir." Another cut directly to her circling the correct answer, calm and steady. A third captured the crowd's eruption, followed by her unforgettable line, "Respect is worth more than $100 million." The captions were brutal. "Arrogance meets genius." "The maid's daughter silences a billionaire." "This is what real wealth looks like." By morning, hashtags trended worldwide. Memes mocked the billionaire's stunned face, side by side with her calm smile. Headlines followed. Humiliated by brilliance, billionaire outwitted by maid's daughter. His name, once a symbol of power, was now synonymous with arrogance unmasked. And hers? Hers was spoken with awe. The maid's daughter, who had asked for nothing but dignity, had earned the respect of millions. The night she solved the problem was only the beginning. By the next morning, the videos had circled the globe. Clips of her steady voice explaining step by step her calm declaration that respect is worth more than $100 million, and the billionaire's stunned silence played across phones, televisions, and headlines everywhere. Strangers who had never met her began to cheer for her as though she belonged to them, a symbol of what brilliance can look like when it rises from unexpected places. Her rise was swift, but not reckless. She accepted the scholarship offered by the philanthropist who had stood for her that night. Within weeks, she was enrolled at one of the world's most prestigious universities. Her tuition, housing, and expenses fully covered. For the first time in her life, she wasn't studying by candlelight or solving equations on scraps of paper. She was in lecture halls, laboratories, and libraries, surrounded by resources she had once only dreamed about. She thrived. Professors marveled at her hunger to learn, her ability to grasp concepts that took others months to understand. She didn't just absorb knowledge, she expanded it. Her classmates, many from wealthy families, quickly learned not to underestimate the maid's daughter, whose story they had already heard whispered in awe. She wasn't just keeping up, she was leading. Years later, she graduated with top honors, and instead of chasing the comfort she had been denied all her life, she turned her attention to others like her, young minds full of brilliance, hidden behind poverty, circumstance, or prejudice. With the support of donors inspired by her story, she launched a foundation that would change lives. Solve for Dignity. The foundation's mission was bold and simple: provide access to STEM education for underprivileged youth, no matter where they came from. She built programs that distributed laptops to children in underserved communities, created scholarships for those who dreamed of becoming scientists or engineers, and launched innovation labs in neighborhoods where opportunity had long been denied. Soon after, she expanded into a tech startup arm, employing graduates of her programs to create tools that bridged gaps in education. Her story inspired millions, but more importantly, it created a ripple effect of opportunity. Young boys and girls who once believed their circumstances limited them began to dream larger. Teachers showed her videos in classrooms. Parents whispered her name to their children as proof that brilliance has no pedigree. Meanwhile, the man who had mocked her found himself in a spiral of decline. His reputation, once burnished by money and power, never recovered from the viral humiliation. The internet has a long memory, and every attempt he made to reclaim prestige was drowned by the same three clips: his sneer, her solution, and his silence. Investors distanced themselves. Social circles that had once celebrated his arrogance now shunned him, unwilling to be tied to a name that had become a global punchline. He remained wealthy, but his wealth no longer commanded respect. He was infamous, not for his empire, but for being destroyed by his own arrogance in front of the world. His story became a cautionary tale. Don't underestimate the quiet ones. Don't mistake wealth for wisdom. Even the hotel where it all happened was transformed by the fallout. Realizing they could not erase the moment but could choose to honor it, the management launched a program dedicated to recognizing and supporting hidden talents among staff and their families. They began offering scholarships for the children of workers, mentorship opportunities, and partnerships with local schools. A plaque was placed in the lounge near the very table where she had been mocked, engraved with her words, "Respect is worth more than 100 million." The viral impact only grew as the years passed. Hashtags surged in waves. Respect over riches. Solve for dignity. Knowledge wins. Every graduation season, her story re-emerged as inspiration for students fighting their own uphill battles. Every International Women's Day, she was celebrated as proof that resilience and brilliance cannot be silenced. And while she stood on stages giving lectures, leading discussions and unveiling projects that empowered thousands, she never forgot where it began. She often returned to her mother and grandmother's words, repeating them to every student who doubted themselves. Dignity doesn't shout, it waits, and then it roars. Her roar had awakened the world, and in its echo, millions found the courage to believe that no background, no insult, no barrier could bury their potential forever. The maid's daughter had become more than a prodigy. She had become a movement. They mocked her bloodline, forgetting brilliance isn't inherited. Through wealth, they looked at her and saw only the daughter of a maid, someone to dismiss, someone to humiliate for sport. Yet in one night their arrogance collapsed, and her mind lit the room brighter than any chandelier above their heads. What they thought was a spectacle of shame became a symphony of triumph. Her story is not just about solving a problem on paper. It is about solving the greater riddle of dignity versus arrogance. She showed the world that true power isn't measured by money stacked in banks, but by knowledge carried in the mind. True wealth isn't flaunted in gold watches and crystal glasses, but found in humility, in the grace to rise without mocking, to win without gloating. And true downfall, it is arrogance, unmasked for the weakness it has always been. She walked in invisible and left unforgettable memories. And her lesson remains. Respect is worth more than any fortune. If you believe genius can rise from anywhere, not just the wealthy and powerful, share this story. Let the world see. Brilliance needs no permission.